poison had already reached his lungs when the palace healers admitted, in quiet and defeated voices, that they had run out of ways to fight it. The Iron Blood Keep had always been known for its strength. Its walls were thick and cold to the touch, cut from dark stone quarried out of the mountains that backed the Northern Territory, and every corridor inside them had been built wide and high, the kind of construction that communicated permanence. The ceilings reached far overhead. The rooms were large enough that voices did not crowd each other. Everything about the structure spoke of something intended to outlast individual lives, and it had already done so across many generations, standing through the kinds of events that flattened lesser buildings and lesser communities. The keep had endured things that should have broken it, and it had not broken, and the people who lived within its walls carried that history quietly. The way you carried something you had inherited and understood was worth keeping. Tonight, the keep felt like it was holding its breath. The great torches in the western corridor burned with their usual steadiness, but the people moving beneath them were not steady. The healers who went in and out of the Alpha King's chamber moved with the tight efficiency of people who were running out of useful things to do, and doing the remaining ones faster to compensate. The guards at the chamber door stood with their backs straight, and their eyes forward, and their faces arranged in the neutral expressions their training required, but their hands were too still at their sides, completely still. People whose hands went completely still during a crisis were usually working against something running underneath the surface, something that would rise if the hands were allowed to move freely. The whole keep was working against something. Alpha King Calum Ashvane had been dying for 5 days, and no one in these walls had yet found a way to make that fact feel like anything other than the catastrophe it was. His reign had lasted 11 years. In those years he had built something in this community that most leaders, if they were honest with themselves, would have acknowledged was genuinely difficult to achieve. He had not done it through performance. He had not secured the loyalty of his pack through grand gestures, or through the kind of stirring rhetoric that could fill a moment beautifully, without filling anything that lasted. He had done it through consistency, which was harder and longer, and had no single dramatic moment that anyone could point to afterward as the day everything changed. He had resolved disputes fairly, even when fairness cost him politically. He had enforced standards that applied to himself with the same firmness they applied to everyone else. He had shown up for the unglamorous things, the grinding, difficult problems that other leaders found reasons to delegate, and he had done so in a way that made clear his presence was a duty he owed, rather than a gift he was bestowing. He had listened when listening was inconvenient. He had made decisions that were correct rather than popular, and when those decisions hurt people, he stayed present for that rather than removing himself from the consequences. He had been, in the ways that actually mattered across a long time, the kind of leader who was very difficult to replace because he was very difficult to replicate. It had taken years for the pack to fully trust this pattern. People who had lived under less genuine leadership carried that experience with them, and they applied their caution to new situations until the pattern had repeated enough times that they could believe in it without risk. Calum had given them the repetitions. He had given them the consistency. He had given them the years. And now the man who had built that trust lay in his chamber with silver threading through his bloodstream, and the people who depended on him were standing in corridors, feeling the certainty they had built shift beneath them, in a way that nothing in their experience had prepared them for, because the certainty had felt permanent, and permanence turning out not to be permanent was a particular kind of shock. Beta Doran had stood outside that chamber for most of the past 5 days. He had slept in the corridor twice, in a chair that one of the junior guards had brought him without being asked, because going to his own quarters felt like a distance he could not afford. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, solid in the way that came from decades of physically demanding work rather than deliberate cultivation. His hair had gone fully gray at the temples several years ago, and there were lines in his face that had deepened visibly in the past 5 days, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation, though he had not been sleeping enough. He was 52 years old, and he had given more than 20 of those years to this work, in one form or another. He had served Calum's father before Calum, and when Calum took the throne at 23, Doran had made the deliberate choice to stay. He had not made that choice out of habit or obligation. He had made it because he had watched the young man carefully in the first weeks of the new reign, and concluded that what he was observing was genuine, and genuine things were worth staying for. He did not make that judgment lightly. He had seen the alternative, and he had a clear understanding of the difference. Right now, the thing behind his trained, steady face was close enough to fear that he had stopped looking at it directly. He was regretting, with focused and contained anger, the dinner 5 days ago. The blade had been small enough to hide inside a sleeve, quick enough to use between one moment and the next without anyone nearby noticing. The cut beneath Calum's shirt had been shallow and clean, barely longer than a finger, and Calum had pressed one hand briefly to his right side and continued his sentence without missing a beat. Doran had caught it, because catching things was what he did, and he had been at Calum's side within 90 seconds. He had looked at the wound and heard Calum say, quietly enough that only he could hear, "It burns. Silver." Within 2 hours, the healing had begun to fail. Within 12, the silver threads were faintly visible under the skin. By the end of the 3rd day, every standard treatment Marin had available had been tried and found inadequate. The silver was deep and moving, and it did not respond the way a thing was supposed to respond when you brought everything you had against it. It simply continued, patient and deliberate, doing what it had been designed to do. The investigation was ongoing. He had trusted people working through the list of who had been present at that dinner, pulling threads carefully, following the small inconsistencies that careful planning always left behind, because no plan was ever as clean as the person who made it believed. They would find whoever had done this. But finding the person responsible would not help Calum in the next 3 days. On the 5th day, Marin had come to him with the expression she wore when she had something important to say, and had already prepared herself to say it, without softening what did not benefit from being softened. She said there was one more option. She said it came from the lower archive, from texts behind the iron door, texts that most healers read only as historical material, because they described methods from an era when the practical boundaries between wolf and human were different from what they had become. The transfusion ritual required a willing human donor, not someone with partial wolf ancestry. A pure-blooded human, someone with no wolf heritage at any point in their lineage. Such people were rare in the Northern Territory, where generations of intermarriage had blurred the old human bloodline significantly. But they existed. They were most likely to be found in the small border settlements, villages that sat at the edge of pack territory and had, through geography more than deliberate policy, maintained more separation from the main wolf population than the interior communities had. The donor's blood would be drawn over 4 to 6 hours, passing through a ritual channel lined with moonstone inlay that purified the blood in transit. The purified human blood, entering the alpha's veins, would dissolve the silver rather than sustaining it the way wolf blood did. The alpha's healing ability would recover once it had a clean foundation. The donor would be significantly weakened afterward. Whether they fully recovered depended on their constitution. Doran asked the necessary question about what happened if the donor's constitution was not enough. Marin answered it without embellishment, and the answer was clear enough not to require any. He sent 12 soldiers out that same night. He briefed them with care and gave them the word volunteer, because he was not willing to frame what he was asking as anything other than what it was. The reports that came back over the following 2 days were consistent in their essential content. Village after village had said no, not cruelly, not without evident regret, but clearly, in the way people said no when they had actually considered the question. The first settlement had listened and offered sympathy. The second had asked questions and then gone silent in the particular way that meant the answer was already no before the questions were finished. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth had been variations of the same final position, offered in different emotional registers. Doran read each report in the corridor and absorbed the weight of them without showing it. He understood the responses. He did not blame the people giving them. He was asking something significant of people who had no particular reason to give it, and declining was a reasonable response to a significant ask. On the 6th day, Marin came to him and said 3 days, perhaps less. The silver was reaching the secondary organ system. He sent the soldiers back out before she finished her sentence. He told them every remaining settlement within 2 days' ride. Every one. He told himself the volunteers would still come. He stood in the corridor after the soldiers left and held, for a precise and limited time, the full weight of what it would mean if he was wrong. Then he put it away, because it was not useful, and went back to managing what could be managed. 3 hours east of the keep, where the land flattened into wide pale fields, and the wind from the eastern hills moved across them without obstacle, there was a village called Hadfield's Crossing. not significant by any measure the northern realm used for significance. It sat on no trade road, produced nothing the wider territory depended on, and had perhaps 200 residents. Its most notable feature was a small stone workshop near the center of the main road, where a woman named Sarah Vane worked as a healer's apprentice under Master Finn, who had been doing this work for 50 years, and who had, in Sarah's honest estimation, forgotten more about medicinal plants than most formally trained healers had ever accumulated. Sarah was 24 years old, not particularly tall. Her dark hair was braided back from her face, and her hands, when she worked, had the precision and steadiness of someone who had been doing careful small work for a long time. She had no wolf lineage, no pack affiliation, no family name that appeared in any record the Northern Realm considered important. She was, in every formal sense, a person without the standing that pack membership conferred, and she had lived with that her whole life, and built what she needed without it, because waiting for something that was not going to come was not something she had ever been willing to do. On the evening of the 6th day of Caleb's illness, Sarah extinguished the workshop lamp, noted in her ledger that the chest cough in the children's households was improving, and walked home through the cold. She thought about the farmer whose arm she needed to check in the morning. She thought about Master Finn's hands, and whether he would treat them without someone there to insist on it. She did not know that 12 soldiers were moving across the border territory, with a question nobody had yet answered. She went to sleep in her small house. The night was clear and cold. The stars over Hadfield's Crossing were the same they had always been. And 4 hours east of her door, a soldier named Owen was riding at a steady pace toward a village he had been specifically assigned because of the particular quality of his manner with ordinary people, because his beta had noted it years ago and had trusted it enough to put it to use now. The world that had been very quiet in Sarah Vane's life was 4 hours from becoming something else entirely. The village of Hadfield's Crossing woke before the soldiers arrived, the way small places always did when something unfamiliar was approaching. First one dog, then another, and by the time the sound of multiple hoofbeats reached the main road, half the village had already made a quiet assessment of the situation, from behind curtains and half-open doors. Nobody ran. Nobody made any dramatic announcement. The collective intelligence of a small community simply turned its attention toward the unfamiliar thing, and went watchful in the practiced way of people who had learned that the space between information and reaction was best kept wide. Sarah heard the dogs from inside the workshop. She was preparing the morning remedies, checking the drying herbs on the ceiling beams, updating the patient ledger with the careful entries that Master Finn had taught her to make before she ever touched a patient, because good records were the foundation good work was built on. She lifted her head when the first dog started, listened for the second, identified the sound as horses moving at a purposeful but unhurried pace, and went back to what she was doing. Soldiers passed through the border villages occasionally. It was not an event that required interrupting a patient record. But the hooves stopped, and they stopped near enough to the center of the village that she could hear, faintly through the workshop walls, the sound of a voice beginning to speak in the measured cadence of someone delivering prepared information. She capped the ink and stood up. She was going to go see what was happening, not because she had a particular feeling about it, because in her experience, things that happened in the center of a community tended to be things that were relevant to the people in that community, and relevant things were worth being present for. She had never understood the instinct to wait for things to become unavoidable before paying attention to them. She had always found it more useful to pay attention early. She put on her coat and went outside. Owen was standing in the road with 4 other soldiers, and he was doing what he had been trained to do in these situations, which was to make himself as non-threatening as was physically possible for a uniformed man on a horse in a civilian village. His hands were visible. His voice was even. He had dismounted, which was a deliberate choice, because a man standing on the ground read differently than a man on horseback. He had positioned himself and his soldiers in a way that left the road clear, so that no one in the gathering felt enclosed. Sarah came to the edge of the gathering that had formed at a careful distance, and stood there and listened. Owen explained it clearly. The Alpha King had been struck 5 days ago with a poisoned blade. The palace healers had tried every method available to them. There was one remaining option, an old ritual, which required the participation of a pure-blooded human donor who was willing to give their blood over a period of several hours for the purpose of displacing the silver contamination and giving the Alpha's system a clean foundation to recover from. He explained what the process involved. He did not omit the difficult parts. He said what it would cost physically. He said full recovery care was provided. He said compensation had been arranged. He said clearly that no obligation was implied, and that willing was the operative word. The gathering listened. A man near the front shifted his weight from one foot to the other. A woman in the middle looked at the road instead of at Owen. Two people at the far edge of the gathering simply turned, without comment, and walked back to their houses. The silence that followed was the same silence. Sarah understood without having been to any of the other villages, that had followed this same speech in every other place Owen had delivered it. She stood at the edge of the gathering and thought about what she had heard. She was a practical thinker. She had been one since childhood, not from disposition alone but from necessity. When you grew up with limited resources and no one to absorb your mistakes, you developed a way of thinking that moved quickly through the variables and arrived at the answer that was actually there, rather than the answer that would be more comfortable. She thought about the requirement. No wolf lineage. She had none. She had been told this a dozen times in her life, by various people who had been curious about her background, or had needed to know for medical purposes, and it had never been a matter of question. She thought about her health, which was good. She had been sick twice in recent memory, once 3 years ago with a winter chest illness, and once 5 years ago with a digestive complaint that had resolved in a week. Neither of these suggested a constitution that was significantly below average. She thought about the 4 to 6 hours that would be required, and what she understood about blood loss and physical recovery, and the indicators that Marin, whom she had not yet met, would be watching for, to ensure the process stayed within safe parameters. She thought about a man 3 hours west with silver in his blood, and 3 days remaining. She thought about the silence in the gathering around her, and the two people who had walked away, and what those things communicated about what was going to happen next, if she also stayed quiet and walked away. She walked forward. She did not make a dramatic announcement. She simply moved from the edge of the gathering to the front of it, and she looked at Owen, and she said clearly enough to be heard, "I will go. I am volunteering." The gathering turned to look at her. It was a collective turn, unhurried, the way a group of people turned to look when something unexpected happened in the space they were all occupying. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved toward her or away from her. She was in a space that was entirely hers, and they all recognized it, and they let it be what it was. Owen looked at her. He looked at her carefully, the way a person looked when they were actually assessing, rather than simply receiving. He produced the moonstone from the pouch at his belt, and explained what he was going to do and why. He took her wrist gently, and pressed the flat side of the stone against the inside of it. The stone stayed clear. Not a shadow, not a trace of clouding, clear. He held it for a moment and looked at it. Then he looked at her. He asked, genuinely, "Are you certain?" She said, "Yes." She said, "Let me speak to Master Finn." She went inside. Master Finn was already in the middle of the workshop with his coat still on, which told her he had gone outside briefly to see what was happening and come back in before she had. He was a tall man despite his age, though the years had curved him slightly at the shoulders, and his eyes behind the lines of his face were exactly as sharp as they had been the day she first walked into this workshop at 12 years old. He looked at her now with those sharp eyes, and she could see him doing what he always did when someone came to him with information, which was receiving it fully, before deciding anything about it. She told him. She told him clearly and completely, without editing the difficult parts, because Master Finn had never appreciated edited information, and she had learned that from the first month. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a person who had not heard, the quiet of a person who had heard everything, and was taking its full weight before responding. He said, "Take the good traveling coat." That was all he said. But she had known him for 12 years, and she understood what the good traveling coat was and was not. It was not permission. She did not need permission. It was recognition. It was his particular and understated way of saying that he saw what she was doing, and he understood what it was made of, and he was not going to diminish it by surrounding it with words it did not need. She changed her coat. She came back outside. She walked to the horses without looking back at the village, not because she was not going to miss it, but because she had made the decision, and she was the kind of person who walked toward the decisions she made, rather than looking back at the place she was walking away from. Looking back was something you did when you were uncertain. She was not uncertain. Owen gave her his horse. She accepted it without arguing, because it was a genuine kindness, and arguing with genuine kindness was a form of ingratitude she saw no point in. They formed up and turned west, and the road ahead was long and pale, and the sky was the flat winter gray of a clear, cold day, and Sarah Vane rode toward a place she had never seen, for a reason she had never imagined having. The other soldiers were respectful, and mostly quiet. Owen rode beside her for the first portion of the journey, and asked her questions with the natural curiosity of a person who found people interesting, without making them feel examined. He asked how long she had been working as a healer's apprentice. She said about 12 years if you counted, from when she had started learning seriously. About 6, if you counted from when she had started managing patient care independently. He asked if she had family in Hadfield's Crossing. She said no, not family exactly, just Master Finn, who was close enough. He nodded, and did not push further. She appreciated the lack of pushing. She had always found it to be the mark of a person who understood the difference between curiosity and invasion. The land changed as they traveled. The flat field country of the eastern border gave way to terrain that rolled and thickened, the road cutting through stands of bare winter trees, crossing streams that ran fast and cold below their bridges. The air had a different quality this far west, sharper and cleaner, the kind of air that came from altitude and distance from settled ground. She breathed it in, and noted the difference the way she noted everything, without making a production of the noting. The keep appeared before she expected it to, as they crested a long rise in the road in the early afternoon. It came into view all at once, and she looked at it with the genuine attention it warranted. She had known it would be large. She had not known it would feel quite so entirely like itself. The Ironblood Keep sat against the mountains behind it, as if it had grown there rather than been built there. The dark stone of its walls continuous with the dark stone of the peaks, the towers rising clean and straight against the pale sky. It was not beautiful in the way decorated things were beautiful. It was beautiful in the way very old, very permanent, very serious things were beautiful, which was a quieter and more lasting kind of beauty, and she recognized it as such, and was not intimidated by it, because recognizing something clearly was different from being overwhelmed by it. They arrived at the main gate in the early afternoon. The keep received them with the efficiency of a place accustomed to receiving people at all hours, for all reasons. Guards moved, gates opened, horses were taken. Owen walked her through the outer courtyard and into the interior, and the interior was warmer than she had expected, lit by torches that burned at regular intervals along the walls, with tapestries between them in deep colors that spoke of different eras and different hands, the accumulated decoration of a place that had been inhabited for a very long time by people who had mattered to each other. She noted this. Marin met them at the interior corridor. She was smaller than Sarah had expected, sharp-boned and gray-haired and moving with the economical precision of someone who had been doing careful work for so long that unnecessary motion had been entirely eliminated from her physical repertoire. She looked at Sarah with a quick and direct assessment, not unkind, just accurate, the assessment of a healer rather than the assessment of a host. She said, "You are the volunteer." Sarah said, "Yes." Marin said her name and her role, and then said that before anything else, she was going to explain the full process in detail, every step, and that Sarah should ask questions about anything that was not clear, because understanding what her body was going to do over the next several hours would allow her to work with the process rather than against it, and that cooperation made a meaningful difference. Sarah said that seemed very sensible. Something shifted in Marin's expression, a form of regard that had not been there before. She said, "Follow me." The ritual chamber was on the lower level, reached through a stairway that descended into the oldest part of the building. Sarah felt the age of it in the quality of the stone, the slightly different texture of walls laid by different hands, in a different century. The chamber itself was large and square, and lit by many candles in iron holders that gave the stone a warmth it did not have under ordinary light. In the center of the room, 2 stone tables lay parallel to each other, with a floor channel system between them, narrow grooves lined with moonstone that caught the candle's light and held it pale and luminous. Sarah looked at it with genuine interest. Marin walked her through every element of the process, with the patience of a teacher, who understood that the quality of explanation determined the quality of what followed. When she finished, She asked if Sarah had questions. Sarah looked at the channel, at the tables, at the empty right table. She asked one question. She asked, "Will he live?" Marin looked at her steadily. She said, "If the ritual proceeds fully, yes. Silver cannot survive in purified human blood. His healing will return once the foundation is clean." Sarah nodded. She said, "Then I am ready." She lay down on the left table. She held out her arms. The last thing she saw before she turned her gaze to the ceiling was Calum Ashvane being placed on the right table. He was tall and pale in the way that had nothing to do with complexion, and his face at rest held even in unconsciousness the expression of a person carrying a very significant amount of weight. There were faint dark lines at his forearms where the silver had tracked. His breathing was shallow but present. She looked at him for a moment. She turned her face to the ceiling. She breathed in. She breathed out. Marin said, "The ritual begins now." And it began. The warmth arrived exactly where Marin had said it would. It started at the inner arms, just below the draw points, and moved downward, in a slow and entirely even flow that was not uncomfortable, not sharp, not sudden, simply warm, and present, and going in a direction. Sarah breathed in, and noted it the way she noted the first symptom of anything, with attention, and without alarm. She breathed out. She fixed her eyes on the stone ceiling, and found the grain of the rock above her, and traced it with her gaze, the way she traced detail in the ledger, when she needed something specific to anchor her attention. The room was very quiet. The candles burned in their iron holders without flickering. Marin moved around the tables at intervals, checking the connections at the draw points, monitoring the flow through the channel, doing the ongoing work of a healer managing a process that required steady attention rather than dramatic intervention. She moved without sound, and spoke only when she had something specific to report, and what she reported calmly, which Sarah found appropriate. There was nothing to be gained from adding emotional weight to information that was already significant. Sarah let herself think, not about the ritual, because there was nothing useful she could do with thinking about it beyond what she was already doing. She thought about other things. She thought about the annotated medical text she had been reading in the workshop before Owen arrived, the one she had been meaning to ask Master Finn about for 2 weeks, because one of the annotations in the 3rd chapter contradicted something the original text stated in the 1st, which either meant the annotator had better information than the original author, or the annotator had made an error, and both possibilities were interesting for different reasons. She thought about whether the improvement she had been seeing in the children's chest cough was genuine, or whether it was the natural lull that this particular kind of cough often showed before returning, which was the kind of distinction that mattered for how you continued treating it. She thought about the fence Harlan was never going to fix, and about whether there was a practical way to get it fixed that did not involve Harlan's direct cooperation. The first hour passed in this way. In the second hour, she felt the beginning of what Marin had described as the deepening weariness. It was not pain, it was not dramatic. It was a quality of tired that was more comprehensive than the surface kind, a tired that reached into the bone rather than staying at the level of muscle and eye. She breathed through it. She maintained the rhythm she had established, and let the tiredness be what it was, and did not fight it, because fighting a thing you could not change was a waste of resource, and she was managing her resources carefully right now. She thought about the structure of the moonstone channel between the 2 tables. She had been looking at it before lying down, tracing the geometry of the grooves cut into the floor, and she had noticed that the pattern was not purely geometric, that there was an organic quality to it as well. Curves within the angles, which she thought was probably not decorative but functional, that the curves served some purpose related to the way the blood moved through the purification process. She did not know enough about the mechanism to say what that purpose was, but she had filed the observation because it was interesting. The 3rd hour was harder. She had known the 3rd hour would be harder. Marin had described the progressive quality of the physical experience clearly, and Sarah had believed her, and belief and actual experience were 2 different things. The draw was present in her bones now, not sharp, not acute, but a steady and undeniable pressure that could not be reasoned away. She breathed. She maintained the rhythm. She looked at the ceiling grain and stayed in the rhythm. The candles around the room were the same candles they had always been. The room was the same room. She was tired, in a way that was very thorough, and she was continuing. In the 4th hour, Marin came to stand between the 2 tables and looked at Sarah with the direct assessment of a healer checking a patient. She said, "How are you feeling?" Sarah thought about the accurate answer. She said, "Very tired." Continuing. Marin nodded. She said, "The process is proceeding correctly. You are doing well." She said it without performance, as information. Sarah received it as information. She turned her head then, because the quality of the room had changed. She could not have explained the change in mechanical terms. It was not a sound that was new. It was not a smell or a temperature shift. It was something less definable, a quality of the air or of the space itself. The particular change that occurred when a condition that had been one thing for a long time became something else. She turned her head toward the right table. Caleb's face had changed. The quality of his breathing was different from what it had been when they brought him in. The shallow, barely there quality had shifted toward something more present, more sustained. His hands, which had been lying open at his sides with the stillness of deep unconsciousness, had moved slightly. One of them lay now with the fingers loosely curled rather than flat. His face, which had been the face of someone entirely absent, had a quality in it now that was different. She watched him for a moment. She turned her face back to the ceiling. She breathed. The 5th hour was the hardest. She had reached a point of physical depletion that she would have described, if someone had asked her, as significant. She was not in danger. She knew what danger felt like in a body, and this was not it. But she was at the edge of the comfortable range of function, past the point where the tired was manageable without active effort, in the territory where continuing required not just the absence of stopping, but the active presence of choice. She chose. Every breath was a choice, and she made it, over and over. In the steady, unhurried way she made all her choices. At some point in the 5th hour, Marin said, "We are close to completion." She said it without raising her voice, the way she said everything. Sarah said nothing. She was conserving what she had for the work of continuing. At some point after that, Marin said, in a voice that was slightly different from its usual register, only slightly, but different, "It is complete." The draw stopped. The warmth in her arms stopped moving. The channel between the tables went still. The particular quality of the process that she had been inside for the past several hours was simply no longer present, replaced by the ordinary quality of a room, with candles and 2 people, and the sound of breathing from both tables. Sarah breathed in. She breathed out. She looked at the ceiling. She was more tired than she had ever been in her life, and she was also completely present, which was interesting. She would have expected depletion to produce a kind of foggy removal from herself, but what she had was a very clear, very quiet, very thorough awareness of her own body, and of the room around her. Marin came to the left table and looked at her with the expression of a healer doing a final assessment. She checked the draw points, removed them with the same careful precision with which she had placed them, applied dressing to the small sites. She checked Sarah's pulse, and her eyes, and her color, and asked several questions, to which Sarah gave accurate answers. Then Marin turned to the right table. Sarah turned her head. Caleb Ashvane was awake. He was looking at the ceiling when she turned her head, and then he turned his head, and he looked at her. He looked at her the way a person looked when they had come back from a very far distance, and were still locating themselves in the world they had returned to. His eyes were dark and clear, and the quality of consciousness in them was present in a way it had not been when he was placed on that table. The silver lines in his forearms were already less visible than they had been. His breathing was steady and even. He looked at her for a moment that seemed to last longer than it probably did. He tried to say something. His voice did not cooperate immediately. He tried again. He said, "Where is she?" His voice was rough from disuse, but it was his voice, and Marin turned from where she had been beginning her assessment of him, and looked at him with the expression of a healer, recalculating what she had been expecting. He said it again, more clearly. "Where is she? Where is the donor?" Marin said, "She is here. She is on the left table. The ritual is complete. Do not move yet." He turned his head back to the right. He looked at Sarah again. He was quiet for a moment. Then his hand on the table, the hand closest to her table, opened slowly, the fingers relaxing, the palm turning upward. Sarah looked at that hand. She looked at the ceiling. She breathed in. She said, to no one in particular. The fence annotation in the 3rd chapter is almost certainly an error. The original author had sources the annotator did not have access to. Marin turned to look at her. Caleb turned to look at her. Sarah was looking at the ceiling, with the peaceful expression of a person who had just solved something they had been thinking about for a while. The room was quiet for a moment. Then, barely audible, hoarse and raw, and nothing like it would normally have sounded, Caleb made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. It lasted only a second, but it was there. Maren looked at him. She looked at Sarah. She looked at the channel on the floor between them, which had gone still and clear and ordinary. She had been a healer for 40 years. She had performed procedures she could explain precisely, and she had observed outcomes she could not explain at all, and she had long ago made her peace with the fact that the two categories would continue to coexist indefinitely. She went back to her work. The candles burned. The room held two people who had just been connected, in a way that neither of them fully understood yet, through something older than either of them, built into the stone beneath them, running in the lines of moonstone on the floor between the two tables. Whatever it was that the channel had carried, it had carried more than blood. The darkness that Caleb Ashvane lived in was not like sleep. He had slept in difficult places and under difficult circumstances for 11 years. He had slept sitting up on horseback. He had slept during border negotiations when there was no one else to take the watch. He had slept badly, and briefly, and frequently, in the way of a person whose life left only margins for it. He knew what sleep felt like, even the deepest kind, even the kind that came after genuine exhaustion. Sleep had a particular quality to it, a softness at the edges, a sense of the body setting down what it was carrying, rather than losing the capacity to carry it. Sleep felt like a pause. This was not a pause. What he had descended into over the 5 days of the Silver's progress was something much older and more total, a kind of vastness that pressed in from every direction simultaneously. It did not feel like rest. It did not feel like anything that had a comfortable word in his vocabulary, because the words he had for states of being were all calibrated for the waking world, and this was not the waking world. It was enormous in the way that deep ocean was enormous, in the way that the space between distant stars was enormous, a vastness that did not particularly acknowledge the smaller things that were inside it. He had no sense of time. He had no sense of his body. He had no specific thoughts, because thoughts required a coherent self to form them, and his sense of his own coherence had thinned over the course of the 5 days, to the point where it sat very far away from him, dim and small, less a presence than the memory of a presence. He did not know how long he had been in the dark. Duration did not register in that place. The dark simply was, uniformly, without before or after. He had not dreamed, or if he had, the dreams had passed without leaving any trace. He had become, eventually, accustomed to the dark in the way you became accustomed to an unchanging condition, not by liking it, but by ceasing to struggle against it. There was a certain stillness that came with that, and it was not comfortable, but it was its own kind of state, and he had been in it when the warmth arrived. It came without warning, without sound, without any quality of approach or arrival. It was simply there, suddenly, where it had not been before, and its presence in the middle of so much absence was immediate and undeniable, in the way that a lit candle, in a completely dark room, was undeniable. Not because it was large, because everything else was dark, and this was not. He noticed it with whatever remained of his attention. His attention in that state was not the focused, precise instrument it normally was. It was slow, and wide, and difficult to direct. But it turned toward the warmth the way a plant turned toward light, not through deliberation, but through something below deliberation, through the instinct of something that had been in the absence long enough to recognize the arrival of what was not absence. The warmth was specific. That was the first thing he understood about it. Not the general warmth of a heated room, or the ambient warmth of sunlight. It had direction. It had source. It was coming from somewhere in particular, rather than everywhere in general, and this specificity was what distinguished it, absolutely, from everything else in the dark, which was uniformly sourceless. Something was sending this warmth from a specific location toward a specific destination, which was him, and the deliberateness of that was unmistakable. He held whatever remained of his attention on it. It was the only effort he had access to in that state, and he gave it completely, because in the enormous dark there was nothing else that warranted it. The warmth continued coming. It did not hurry, and it did not slow. It arrived with the quality of something that had no reason to rush, something moving at its own true pace, and underneath the warmth, underneath the simple physical sensation of it, there was something else. Not a sound, not a picture, not a memory. Not any of the things that the waking world communicated in. It was something more like a quality, the residue of a person, the particular flavor of someone's interior life. You could not look at it directly. You could only receive it, the way you received the character of a room that someone had lived in for a long time without seeing the person. He received it. There was steadiness in it, a deep, constitutional steadiness, the kind that was not learned or practiced but simply there from the beginning, built into someone the way their height was built in. He felt this and recognized it because he had spent 11 years cultivating something like it in himself, and he knew what the difference was between the cultivated kind and the kind that was simply how someone was made. What was coming through the warmth was the second kind. It did not exert itself. It did not maintain itself. It simply was. There was grief in it too, not the sharp kind, not the acute and overwhelming kind that stopped you in your tracks. The old kind, the kind that had been lived with long enough to settle from a wound into a permanent texture, the kind that shaped the surface of a person without stopping them from moving. He did not know what the grief was for. He did not need to. He received it the way you received a true thing about a person, without requiring the story behind it to confirm that the truth was real. There was humor underneath the grief. Quick and light, private, the kind of amusement that surfaced regardless of external circumstances, because it was a characteristic of the person, rather than a response to conditions. He felt it in flickers, brief and genuine, the particular quality of someone who found things ironic and did not need an audience for the finding. This was not performance. This was simply how the person moved through things, with a private appreciation for what was absurd about them, and he found it more clarifying than anything else that had come through. There was courage in it. Not the loud kind, not the kind that announced itself, the kind that showed up in the decision to step toward something that everyone else had stepped away from, and to do so quietly, without requiring acknowledgement of what the stepping toward cost. He felt this and understood it, somehow, with a certainty that had no logical basis in the dark, understood what the courage had been applied to, understood that it had been applied to him. And underneath all of it, underneath the steadiness and the grief and the humor and the courage, there was something he could not name in any language he had, something that was the foundation on which the others rested. He felt it and could not classify it, and did not try to, because trying to classify something that was larger than his available categories would only have reduced it, and he did not want it reduced. It felt like being chosen, specifically and deliberately chosen, not because of what he was or what he represented, not because of the practical utility of his continued existence to the people who depended on him. Chosen the way a person was chosen when someone looked at the actual situation clearly, and the person who was being chosen was a man dying in the dark, and the person doing the choosing was someone who did not know him, and she chose anyway. She chose, and she did not waver from the choice. He had been in the dark for a very long time. He had been in it alone. He had no one to point that out to, and no one to receive it, so it had simply been the condition of his existence in that place, enormous and cold and entirely without direction. And then something was in it with him that was not dark. Something warm and specific and real was in the middle of all that vastness, and it was pulling in a direction he had forgotten was available, and it was pulling not because it had to, and not because any obligation required it, but because whoever was pulling had decided to, had simply, clearly, decided to. Something in him, something below the level of thought, below the level of the thin and distant sense of self that was all that remained of him in that state, said no, said it plainly, and without elaboration. Not no to the dark, not no to the silver, not even no to the dying, exactly. No to the idea of letting go of whatever was on the other end of that warmth. No to the idea of being in the dark while something that had come all this way was on the other side of it, steady and choosing and not letting go. He turned toward it. This was not a quick process. It was not a dramatic recovery, not a single moment of decisive return. It was slow and steady, and required sustained effort against the inertia of something that had been in place for a long time. He turned toward the warmth, and the warmth kept coming, and he moved through the dark toward it by degrees, making the same choice repeatedly, not once but many times, because in that depth, each increment of progress required the choice to be made again from the beginning. The darkness thinned at the edges first. Not gone, but less. The enormous pressure eased by degrees, the way a storm eased when it had been moving for a long time and was beginning to exhaust itself. The sense of his own body began to return, first as abstract awareness, and then as specific sensation. The surface beneath him, the temperature of the air, something different in his blood, something moving through it that was not the silver, something warm and clean. He became aware of sound, very faint, a soft, steady drip from the channel between the tables. Breathing that was not his own, slow and measured. The breathing of a person who was working at staying steady, because the alternative was letting the effort go, and they were not letting the effort go. The light came through his eyelids. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was stone, and candlelight and shadow. He looked at it with the full and stunned attention of a person returning to a world they had not been certain they would see again. The ceiling was the most ordinary thing in existence, and he looked at it as if it were extraordinary, because at that moment it was. He turned his head. He saw Marin between the tables, watching the channel, her hands clasped, her face doing the thing it did when she was holding herself to a professional standard, while something significant happened around her. He turned his head the other way. He saw the left table. He saw the woman. She was lying with her arms at her sides and her face turned slightly upward, and her eyes closed, and her breathing slow and effortful, and costing her something he had not had to watch anyone pay before. She was pale in the recent way, rather than the constitutional way. Her hair was dark and braided, and several strands had come loose across her cheek. He had felt her in the dark. He knew this with the certainty of something understood below the level of information, already incorporated, rather than newly learned. The warmth that had come into the vast emptiness, and pulled him back through it, had come from her. She had been on the other side of it for the entire time. She had not let go. He tried to speak. The first attempt produced nothing. His throat had not been used in 5 days. He tried again. He said, "Where is she?" Marin crossed to him. She assessed him rapidly. She looked at his eyes, and checked his pulse, and examined his forearms where the silver lines were already fading. She said, "She is here. The ritual is complete. Do not move." He did not move. He turned his head back to the ceiling, and he breathed, and he let the returning clarity of his own existence spread through him by degrees, the warmth of the blood in his veins, the weight of his own hands, the ordinary and extraordinary fact of being alive and knowing it. But his hand on the table, the hand closest to her table, opened slowly. The fingers relaxed. The palm turned upward. He was not aware of directing this. He was aware of it having happened. The room was quiet around them. The candles continued to burn. Marin went about her assessment with the composure of a woman who observed things, and filed them, and did not speak about them until she understood them. On the left table, very quietly, Sarah Vane said, "The fence annotation in the 3rd chapter is almost certainly an error. The original author had sources the annotator did not have access to." The room was still for a moment. Then, from his direction, there was a sound. Rough and barely formed, but real. It was not quite a laugh. It was the beginning of one, broken off before it could become anything full, because his lungs were not yet equipped for full responses. But it was there, and it was genuine. Marin looked between the 2 tables. She went back to her work. But something had happened in the room between the 2 tables, something that had moved through the Moonstone Channel along with everything else, and it was still there, warm and present and entirely new in the world, and none of the 3 people in the room had quite the right language for it yet. That was all right. Language could wait. The most important things usually found their words eventually. The morning of his full recovery came into the keep quietly. There was no announcement. There was no single moment the people could point to afterward, as the instant everything changed. There was simply Marin, emerging from the western stairway at dawn, with an expression that the corridor guards had never seen on her face, and that expression was enough. They did not need her to say anything. They read it correctly, immediately, the way people who had been holding their breath for 5 days read the first genuine sign that they could exhale. The news moved through the keep with the speed that news always moved through a closed community, where everyone was paying very close attention to a single thread. It followed every available channel simultaneously, going through the healer's rotation, and the guard stations, and the morning kitchen rounds, and every informal pathway that connected the people in this building to each other. It arrived at each person in a slightly different form, filtered through whoever had passed it on. But its essential content was the same everywhere. The ritual had worked. The Alpha King was recovering. In a chamber on the lower level, Maren completed her final assessment of Calum Ashvane and allowed herself, for precisely the duration of the walk from his table to the door, to feel the full weight of what it meant that the assessment had gone the way it had. She had been a healer for 40 years. She had presided over recoveries that she had expected and ones she had not. She had sat with people through outcomes in both directions. She understood, from long experience, that the relief you felt when a thing went right was not diminished by the certainty that eventually something would go wrong, and that the correct response to the relief was to feel it fully and then return to the work. She felt it. Then she went to find Doran. He was in the corridor where she had expected him, because he had been in the corridor for most of 5 days, and she had long since stopped expecting him to be anywhere else. She came to him and told him simply what she had found, and what his vital signs were showing, and what her prognosis was for the recovery. She told him she expected full recovery. She told him the progression was faster than she had anticipated. He listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor. He looked back at her. His face did not change in any way that would be visible to someone who did not know him. But Maren had known him for 8 years, and she read what was in the stillness accurately. She nodded, once. She turned and went back to her work. Doran breathed in. He breathed out. He had not known, until that moment, that he had been holding it. Calum was moved back to his own chamber as soon as Maren declared him stable enough for the transfer. He cooperated with the transfer with more graciousness than Doran might have expected, which he read as an accurate indicator of how much the 5 days had cost him physically, because under ordinary circumstances, Calum had specific opinions about being moved when he was capable of moving himself. Doran came to the chamber an hour after the transfer. He sat in the chair beside the bed without being invited to, and he looked at the man in that bed, who was pale and depleted, and more visibly tired than Doran could remember seeing him, and who was also unmistakably present. The eyes were clear, the breathing was even. He was here in the room in the way that mattered, not just occupying it, but actually inhabiting it. Doran said, "You look terrible." Calum said, "Thank you." His voice was rough, from 5 days of disuse, but it was his voice, and there was the dry edge in it that Doran had heard in it for 11 years, and the presence of that dry edge was more reassuring than anything Maren had said. They sat together for a moment, in the comfortable way of people who had known each other long enough to have earned the silence between them. Then Calum asked about the investigation. Doran told him progress was being made, specifics when he was stronger. Calum considered pushing on this, and chose not to, which told Doran everything about the actual state of his energy. Then Calum said, "The ritual, the donor. Where is the donor?" Doran chose his words with the care he usually gave to words that were going to determine the shape of what came next. He said that the donor had been transported back to her village, as per the arrangement made with her before the ritual began. Calum was quiet. Not a comfortable quiet. A quiet with something working inside it. He said, "Stop the transport." He said it without heat and without urgency, which made it more final than either of those would have. He said, "Tell her I would like to speak with her before she leaves. Make clear she is not obligated to come back. If she would prefer to continue home, I will respect that. But give her the choice." Doran looked at him. He had known this man for 11 years. He read the space behind this request with the accuracy that 11 years produced. He did not comment on what he read. He said, "I will go myself." He caught the transport on the eastern road 20 minutes outside the main gate. Owen was in the lead, riding at an easy pace, and the woman on the horse beside him turned to look at the sound of Doran's approach, with the expression of someone who had heard the approaching hooves and was waiting without alarm to see what they meant. Doran pulled his horse alongside hers. He looked at her properly for the first time. The previous encounter had been brief and logistical, and he had not had the occasion to look at her as a person, rather than as the solution to an urgent problem. She was younger than his mental image of her had been, for reasons he could not account for. She looked tired in the deep and comprehensive way that the ritual would explain, but she was sitting straight on the horse, and her eyes were clear, and she was looking at him, without arranging her face into anything particular for the encounter. He told her that the Alpha King was awake and recovering well, and wished to speak with her before she left, and that she was under no obligation to agree. She said, "Is he well? Is he actually well?" He said, "He is." Maren expects full recovery. She was quiet. She looked at the road ahead of her, and then at the flat winter sky, and then back at him. She said, "All right." She turned her horse and went back. They put them in a small receiving room off the main corridor, plain and simply furnished, 2 chairs near a window that looked out over the outer courtyard. Maren had told Calum not to stand for extended periods, and he had, uncharacteristically, agreed to this instruction, which told Doran the depletion was genuine. But he had risen from the chair when the woman entered, because he was apparently not capable of remaining seated when a person came into a room under these circumstances, and he was standing in the middle of the space with the slightly unfamiliar quality of someone who did not entirely know what to do with their hands. The woman came through the door. She was carrying herself with the straightforward tiredness of someone who had traveled far and slept little, and was managing both with the absence of drama. She looked at the room with a brief, genuine attention, and then she looked at him. Calum looked at her. Whatever was happening in the space between them in that moment, Doran, standing to the side, kept his face neutral and his observations private. She asked if he was recovered. He said yes. She said good, and turned slightly toward the door, because she was apparently the kind of person who concluded visits when their purpose had been achieved, rather than extending them past their natural end. He said, "Stay." It came out of him differently than a command. It came from somewhere below his usual register of authority, which was the only register Doran had ever heard him use with other people. It was quieter than authority. It was more immediate, and it surprised him enough that she could see it had surprised him, which was visible in his face for a moment, before the careful arrangement came back. She stood in the middle of the room, and looked at him, and then at the door, and then back at him. She said, "For a few days." She said it not as a yes and not as a no, but as the opening of a space, a held decision, a not yet closed possibility. He said, yes. That was the agreement. Doran filed it. He gave her a room on the 2nd level with an east-facing window, because Maren, who had noticed things about the woman during the recovery period, had said she seemed to prefer natural light to artificial, and that the east-facing room would have the morning sun before any other room on that corridor. Whether this was the right call or not, Doran could not say. He had simply followed the advice of someone who had spent 6 hours watching a person carefully and had formed an opinion. The next morning, Calum asked how she was adjusting. Doran said she had eaten her entire meal at dinner and asked the kitchen staff whether the bread was made in-house. Calum looked at him. He said, "And?" Doran said, "And they told her it was, and she said it was very good, and she went back to the compendium you sent her." A silence. Then Calum said, "Good." It was a small word, and Doran had heard him say it many times in many contexts, but there was a quality to it this time that was slightly different from all the other times, slightly more personal, slightly less official. He filed that too. On the 3rd day, Calum went to the woman's room in the evening carrying a different book from the compendium he had already sent, and he stayed for nearly 2 hours, and when he came back out, he was moving through the corridor with a quality that was slightly different from his usual quality of movement. Not better or worse. Just different. The way a person moved when something had shifted in them that they had not yet fully identified or named. Doran watched him go. He thought about the first council meeting, about a young man at the head of a table full of experienced people, measuring the gap between his potential and his current capacity. He thought about what he had seen in that meeting that had convinced him to stay. He thought that whatever was happening in the east-facing room with the morning light, it was probably the most human thing Calum Ashvane had done in 11 years. He thought that was probably good. He went back to his own work and left it where it was, because some things developed correctly when they were left alone, and this looked like one of them. The room they gave Sarah faced east. On the first morning she woke to pale light coming in before the corridor was lit, and she lay still for a moment and noted it the way she noted anything that turned out to be better than she had expected. She had expected the keep to feel cold in the interior sense, not in temperature, but in the way that places with a great deal of formal authority sometimes felt cold, as though the function of the space had squeezed out any residue of ordinary living. But it did not feel that way. The bed was genuinely comfortable. The shelf along the wall held space for things without requiring anything to fill it. The writing table had paper and ink arranged by someone who had thought about where a right-handed person would want them. Someone had put these things here with the intent that the person occupying this room should actually be comfortable, and the difference between that intent and its absence was felt in every small practical detail. She spent the first day resting. Marin had been specific and unambiguous about this, and Sarah understood the medical rationale well enough not to argue with it. She read the compendium that had arrived at her door in the morning, carried by a young palace attendant named Nora, who introduced herself with the warm directness of a person who found meeting new people genuinely interesting. Nora was perhaps 18, with an open manner, and the particular kind of curiosity that came from someone who had grown up in a place full of people, and found each of them worth knowing. She told Sarah, within the first 10 minutes, that the palace staff was not entirely sure how to categorize her. She said this with the slightly apologetic directness of someone reporting an accurate thing they thought the other person deserved to know. She said people were being polite, but there was a quality of uncertainty underneath the politeness. She said that most guests who stayed at the keep for the first time were so nervous at dinner that they barely ate, and that Sarah had eaten her whole meal and asked the kitchen staff whether the bread was made in-house, and that this had been the topic of considerable conversation in the kitchen afterward. Sarah said that she had been tired, and tiredness in her experience mostly canceled out nervous, and that the bread had been excellent. Nora looked at her with the expression of someone who had encountered something they were going to be thinking about later. Then she said she would come back in the morning, and left. Sarah went back to the compendium. Calum arrived at her door in the early evening on the first day. She had not expected this. She had expected to be left largely to herself, which was not an unwelcome expectation, and to present herself when her presence was required for some formal purpose related to the conclusion of her stay. She had not expected the Alpha King, in simpler clothes than she had yet seen on anyone in his court, to appear at her door carrying a book. She looked at the book before she looked at him. It was a thick volume, well used, the binding showing the wear of being opened many times. He said that Marin had mentioned she liked to read. She pointed out that she had only met Marin that day, and Marin could not know this yet. He explained that he had asked Marin to ask her during the recovery period, and that she had apparently asked Marin about 3 books on the shelves in the ritual chamber, and whether any of them had been updated since their original editions, and he had taken this as sufficient evidence of the preference. He set the book on the table near the door, the Ironblood Medical Compendium, most current edition. She looked at it. She looked at him. She said that he had brought his medical compendium as a social offering. He said he had brought what she would actually want. He said the alternative was flowers, and he thought she might find those considerably less useful. She laughed. It came out before she had quite decided to let it, brief and genuine, and it seemed to surprise them both in the way that unplanned things surprised people even when they were not serious. He stayed for a short time that first evening. He stood near the door, which communicated that he was not intending to stay long, and he asked how she was feeling, and listened to her answer, as though the answer actually mattered to him, which was a quality she noticed, because she had encountered it infrequently enough, that it was still notable. He asked about her work in Hadfield's Crossing, and followed up on what she said in ways that made clear he had actually heard it, rather than waiting for her to finish, so he could speak again. He left when her meal was getting cold, with a simple courtesy that was neither formal nor casual, but was appropriate, in a way that required someone to have thought about it, which meant someone had. She ate her meal. She read until the candle burned low. She slept well. On the second evening, he brought a different book. He sat this time, on the other side of the small room, without asking whether that was acceptable, which she found she did not mind. The conversation moved from the polite surface downward in the natural way conversations moved, when the people having them were genuinely interested in each other, rather than performing the motions of getting acquainted. By the 5th evening, the conversation had settled into something that did not need to manage itself anymore. It moved where it wanted to move, and where it wanted to move was, she was finding, frequently interesting. She learned things about him in the way you learned things about people who answered questions honestly when asked directly, which was the approach she had always found most efficient. He had taken the throne at 23 when his father died, before the succession was fully prepared. He had walked into the first council meeting of his reign, surrounded by people twice his age, who were measuring the distance between what he was and what he would need to become. and he had run that meeting with the discipline of a man who was not going to let anyone see that distance. He had been doing the same thing, to varying degrees, in various rooms, for 11 years since. He did not say it in those terms. He said it in the matter-of-fact language of someone describing the ordinary texture of their work, and she heard what the texture was actually made of, because she had always been better at hearing what was underneath what people said than what they were saying directly. He had not been sleeping adequately. She could tell this from the way sleep appeared in his account of his days, in the margins of other things, rather than as a properly protected portion of the structure. She could tell it from the quality of his tiredness, when he stopped performing and simply sat, which happened gradually across the evenings, the formal carefulness coming down by degrees, like a coat finally being set aside at the end of a long day. On the 5th evening, she told him that from what she could observe, he had not been maintaining the things a person needed to maintain in order to keep functioning well over a long time, and that this was visible. He studied her for a moment. He said that most people did not say things like that to him. She said that most people were probably being careful with him, and that careful was not always the same as honest. Something moved in his expression that she was not yet expert enough at reading him to fully name. It was not displeasure. It was the look of a person encountering something they had not anticipated, and were taking the honest measure of, without deciding immediately whether it was welcome. He said, "The palace staff does not know what to make of you." He said it not as a criticism, but as an observation, with the same quality she had noticed in everything he said, which was that it was what he actually thought, rather than a managed version of it. She said, "I know. Nora told me." He said, "Nora told you." She said, "She is a very open person." She said most guests are too nervous their first evening to eat properly, and that I ate my whole meal and asked about the bread. He said, "You were not nervous." She said, "I was tired." They cancel each other out, in my experience. He was quiet for a moment, and then the expression that had been almost a smile on the first evening became a real one, brief and uncomplicated, the kind of smile that came out when something surprised it out of a person, rather than when a person decided to produce one. It changed his face considerably from its usual careful arrangement. It made him look younger, and more like the person he probably was when he was not carrying 11 years of public responsibility around his neck. She looked at her book for a moment, instead of at him, because the moment had a particular quality to it that called for looking somewhere neutral briefly. He said, "Tell me something ordinary about the village." She thought. She said, "There is a farmer named Harlan who injured his forearm on a fence post 3 times in the past year. The fence has never been repaired. I believe he finds the injury more manageable than the fence." He laughed. A short, genuinely surprised sound, pulled out of him by something he had not seen coming. It lasted only a second, but it was real, and it was nothing like the careful, managed amusement he deployed in public when something mildly entertaining occurred. They sat in the room with the east-facing window while the evening went on around them, talking about things large and small, and the silence between topics had the quality of silence between two people who had found, without particularly looking for it, that the other person's presence made a space feel different than it felt without them. Neither of them named what was building. They were both, she was discovering, people who did not reach for certainty before it was available. But they were also both perceptive enough to feel the weight of a thing even when its shape was still becoming clear. It was there, in the room, in the quality of the quiet, in the particular way the evenings lengthened without either of them moving to end them, in the fact that by the 7th evening Nora had stopped coming to refresh the tea, because she had learned that whoever was using the room at that hour would not notice the tea going cold. It was there, and it was growing, the way things grew when they had genuine roots in genuine soil, rather than having been arranged to appear that way. On the 8th morning, Nora appeared at her door with a bright expression and said that people were starting to notice, and that the palace was beginning to talk, and that she personally thought it was wonderful. Sarah said, "What specifically are people noticing?" Nora said that the Alpha King, who before your arrival typically concluded his evenings with correspondence and a short walk in the inner yard, and then retired, now arrives at a specific corridor on the 2nd level carrying books, and does not leave for considerably longer than any previous visit to any previous guest has lasted. Sarah looked at her for a moment. She said, "He brings very interesting books." Nora looked at her with the expression of someone who did not quite believe this explanation, and also found that disbelief charming. She left. Sarah sat by the east-facing window and let the morning light come in, and thought about books, and about what was interesting about them, and about the fact that the quality of a book depended entirely on the quality of conversation it generated, and about how long it had been since she had had this particular kind of conversation, the kind that assumed the other person was paying attention because they actually were. She thought about staying. She had been thinking about it since the fourth day, in the way she thought about things she was not ready to decide, which was to hold the thought where she could see it without looking at it directly. She let it be there. She let it sit at the edge of her awareness, while she did other things, and waited to see what it became when she was not pressing on it. On the 9th evening, Caleb brought no book. He came to the door and said he thought they might walk, if she was recovered enough. She had been recovered enough for several days, and she said so. They walked in the inner courtyard in the cold evening air, past the stone walls and the winter bare planting beds, and the conversation was different out of doors than it was inside, slightly freer, slightly less careful, the open air doing something to the space between people that enclosed spaces did not do. He told her, outside, about his father. Not the official record of his father's reign, which she had heard summarized in the context of his own ascension, but his father as a person, the specific texture of the relationship, the things he had learned from him, and the things he had not been able to learn, because the time had run out before the learning was finished. She listened without interrupting. She said, when he was done, that she understood the particular quality of an incomplete relationship, because her mother had died when she was 11, and she had spent years in the subsequent decades realizing new things her mother had not had the chance to finish teaching her. He said, what kinds of things? She said, useful ones, mostly, practical things. How to trust what you know when everyone around you is uncertain. How to stay in a difficult room without letting the difficulty of the room determine your decisions. He looked at her. He said, you learned those anyway. She said, I had good teachers for the second round. He said nothing, but something in his face said that he was filing what she had said, and that it had landed somewhere specific. They walked the full length of the inner courtyard twice before going back inside. It was cold enough to see their breath. She was warm anyway, in the good traveling coat, which she had not yet packed away. That night she lay in the east-facing room and listened to the quiet keep around her, and thought that this was a strange and unexpected place to find yourself, and also that strange and unexpected were not the same as wrong. She thought about the fence in Hadfield's Crossing that Harlan was never going to fix. She thought about the keep's corridors and the library she had not yet asked permission to visit. She thought about evening walks in cold air, and about books brought to her door, and about a laugh surprised out of someone who did not laugh easily. She let those thoughts sit where they were. She went to sleep. It began with amusement, which he later thought was very characteristic of her, though he did not yet know her well enough to think that at the time. He was in his private study on the 14th morning of her stay, working through the correspondence that had accumulated during his illness, and that Doran had organized into carefully ordered categories of priority. The work was real and substantial, and required genuine attention, and he was giving it genuine attention. He was in the middle of reading a report about the Eastern trade assessments when the amusement arrived. He knew immediately that it was not his own. He had been startled the first few times, in the days before he had begun to understand what was happening. Now he recognized the feeling the way you recognized a voice you had heard many times before, by its particular quality, rather than any single identifying feature. His amusement felt different from this. His was slower to arrive, and more dry in its texture. What was coming through now was quicker, lighter, with the particular quality of someone who had just been proved right about something they had quietly predicted, and was experiencing the private satisfaction of that, without needing to announce it to anyone. He set down the report. He was already standing before he made the conscious decision to stand. He moved into the corridor and turned left, which was not the direction his study suggested, and he walked until he reached the door of the restricted library and opened it without knocking. She was at the back shelving, the section that held the oldest texts. She had a volume open in her hands, and she was reading it with the focused absorption of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for. The quality of her posture, the particular stillness of someone deep in something that was delivering what it promised, matched exactly the feeling that had walked him down the corridor. She looked up when the door opened. She looked at the book. She looked back at him. She explained, with a composure that suggested she had considered this possibility and had her response prepared, that she had asked Nora which room was the restricted library, and Nora had told her, and Nora had also described the access protocol, and the access protocol as described did not include her name on the excluded list. She said she had taken that as a reasonable basis for access. He looked at her for a moment. He said she could have asked him for permission. She said she could have, but she had not been certain the answer would be yes, and she had not wanted to put him in the position of saying no to something she had a reasonable case for, which would have been awkward for him. He thought about this. He said, "You were protecting me from an inconvenient situation." She said, she was solving the problem practically. He was quiet for a second. Then he moved a chair from the reading table to where she was standing, and sat down in it, because he was curious about what she was reading, and about what the particular amusement had been for, and asking was more direct than standing in the doorway. She showed him the shift in handwriting she had found, the place in the text where the original author's hand ended and a different hand began. She showed him the evidence in the ink quality and the letter formation. She told him that the later annotator had corrected several of the original author's conclusions, and that this was either because the annotator had better sources, or because the annotator had made an error, and that based on the specific content of the corrections, she believed it was an error, and she was satisfied about this, because she had been thinking about it since she first saw the text. He said, "And you were right just now." She said, "I had been working through the argument, and the last piece resolved itself." He said, "And that is why you were so pleased." She looked at him, and something moved in her expression that was the equivalent of a raised eyebrow, which was that she was not going to confirm or deny that, but that the not confirming or denying was itself a confirmation. He pulled his chair slightly closer to the shelving so he could read the passage she was showing him. They spent an hour in the restricted library discussing the history of the text and the identity of the annotator, and what the corrections revealed about the state of medical knowledge in different periods. Doran came to the door eventually with the expression of a man who had been looking for him for long enough to have formed opinions about it, and Calum went back to his study. He thought, at his desk with the trade report in front of him, about the hour in the library. He thought about how the amusement had arrived before he had any explanation for it, and how his feet had already known where to go. He thought about the other times in the past 2 weeks, when something had moved him without his conscious direction, the times he had found himself already going somewhere before he knew he was going. He put these thoughts at the edge of his attention where they had been sitting, and did not look at them directly yet. They were not ready to be looked at directly. He was certain of this the way he was certain of things he could not yet explain, which was with the particular certainty of someone who had learned to trust their own sense of when to wait. 3 days later, the grief came. He was in a meeting about the eastern border allocation, discussing the technical specifics of a resource distribution question with 2 of his territorial advisors, when it arrived. Not sudden, not sharp, a quiet and steady pressure, the long-carried kind, something that sat in a person and was not actively painful, but was always present. He recognized the texture of it without being able immediately to say why it was familiar, and then he was able to say why, and he finished the sentence he was speaking, and continued the meeting for 15 more minutes, and managed it adequately before excusing himself. He walked to the small garden off the east corridor. She was sitting on the low wall with a letter in her hands. Her face had the quality of someone far inside themselves, in a private internal place that had nothing to do with the cold garden or the flat afternoon light on the stone. She was not crying. She was simply somewhere deep and quiet, in the way that people went when they had received news that needed to be absorbed rather than reacted to. He came through the door and stood near her without speaking. She looked up. She looked at the letter. She said she was sorry, that she had found it inside the compendium he had lent her, that it must have been left there as a marker. She said it was not her letter. He came closer. He looked at the handwriting on the page, and he did not need more than a glance to recognize it. He told her it was from his mother. He had not known the letter was in the compendium. He had probably not opened that volume in years. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at it for a moment, the familiar slant of the letters, the particular way his mother had always pressed the pen slightly harder at the end of each line, as though finishing the thought required a small additional emphasis. He said that she had died when he was 19, 4 years before he became Alpha. He said she would have been good at this, by which he meant all of it, The position and the keep and the work of holding things together. She had understood people in a way that did not require effort, and he had had to find that understanding through effort. And sometimes what you found through effort was not quite the same as what was simply natural. Sarah said, "You are better at it than you think." He looked at her. She said, "Other people tell you what they think you want to hear. I am telling you what I actually observe. They are not the same thing." He sat down on the low wall beside her, leaving appropriate space between them, and they sat in the cold garden together, in the way that people sometimes sat with another person when a difficult feeling had arrived, and the other person's presence made it more manageable without making it go away, which was the only kind of help that actually worked with the old, long-settled kind of grief. They did not talk about the letter. They talked about other things gradually, and the grief on both sides settled back into the places it lived in them, and the afternoon went on in its ordinary way, around two people sitting on a stone wall in a cold garden who had found, without particularly planning to, that the texture of each other's company was something they had started to count on. He was thinking, walking back inside, about how he had known she was in the garden before he could see or hear her. He had felt the grief before he had a direction for it. He had already been going before he had made a decision to go. He thought about the library, 3 days ago. He thought about the 6 or 7 other times in the past 2 weeks when he had turned a corner or opened a door and found her on the other side of it without having planned to look. He had been holding this collection of events at the edge of his attention rather than looking at them directly. Now, walking back to the eastern corridor, he looked at them. He could not have explained what he was thinking to someone who asked, not in language that would have satisfied a logical person, but the thought was clear to him. Something was happening between them that was not entirely about choice. There was something below the level of choice that was already oriented, already attending, already moving in her direction, before his thinking mind had anything to say about it. He filed it. He returned to his work. He did not tell anyone. 8 days after the library, Pack Lord Leon arrived from the western settlements. Calum had been managing Leon carefully for years, with the particular kind of diplomatic care that required constant attention, because Leon was the kind of man who tested limits the way water tested a container, steadily, and from all angles, never forcefully enough to make the testing undeniable, but always present enough to ensure the limits were never forgotten. Leon understood power primarily as something that flowed toward people like him, and he had never fully reconciled himself to the reality that the territory's power was not organized for his benefit, and this had expressed itself over the years in a consistent pattern of small pressures and unambiguous probing. He arrived with a delegation of 6 within the accepted protocol, and Calum received him appropriately, because appropriate reception was what the protocol required, and Calum followed protocol even when he would have preferred to do otherwise. 2 hours into the delegation's stay, Calum was in the map room with his territorial advisor reviewing the border agreement revisions when he felt it. It came between one word and the next, without transition, without warning of any kind. Sharp, clear, directional. A quality of fear that was nothing like anything he had felt from her before, because she was not a person who showed him fear in the weeks he had been receiving things from her. She was someone who showed him steadiness, and old grief, and private amusement, and the particular quiet courage of a person who had been stepping toward difficult things for a long time. Fear was not part of that profile, and what had just arrived was unmistakably fear, and it was unmistakably hers. He was moving before he had decided to. He left the map room without explanation. He moved through the corridor at a pace that was faster than his usual walking pace, and significantly shorter than the pace that would have required him to account for the looks of the people he passed. He knew where he was going, without knowing how he knew. He crossed the main corridor and turned into the eastern wing and moved down the long passage toward its far end. He heard Leon's voice before he turned the corner. He turned the corner. Leon was at the far end of the east corridor with 2 of his delegation members. They were arranged across the corridor's width in the casual way of people who are not technically blocking a passage, but are positioned in a way that makes using it uncomfortable. Sarah was in the remaining space, her back 2 feet from the wall, and she had her face arranged in the careful neutral expression she used when she was managing a situation she did not like. Leon was speaking to her in the low, patient tone of a man who was accustomed to the effect of his physical size and his territorial standing on people who possessed less of both, and who had been applying both with the ease of long practice. Calum came to the end of the corridor and stopped. He did not speak, he simply arrived, and he was present in the way he was present when he was not managing his own presence, when the management had been set down because the situation called for something below that level. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any gesture toward the authority he held. He simply stood at the end of the corridor and looked at Leon, and the quality of that look communicated something that did not need words. The two delegation members moved away from the wall without being directed to. Leon turned around and rearranged his face with the ease of a man who had been rearranging his face for difficult situations for a long time. Calum looked at him. He said, "Walk." Leon walked. The corridor cleared in the way corridors cleared when the Alpha King decided their occupants needed to be elsewhere. In under a minute it was only the two of them, and Sarah was standing with her back still near the wall, and her careful expression still in place, and there were 3 questions in her eyes. She said, "How did you know?" He looked at her. He thought about the library and the garden and this corridor and the 6 or 7 times before that. He thought about the warmth and the dark. He thought about what he had been not looking at for 2 weeks and had been holding at the edge of his attention and had never quite been willing to bring directly into focus. He said, "I felt you. I felt you afraid, and I already knew where you were before I decided to come." She was still. He said, "I felt you. I felt you. I felt you. I felt you." He said, "I felt you." He said, "I felt you." He said, "I felt you. I felt you. I felt you." Not thoughts, not images. Something less specific, just feelings, impressions, the emotional content of what you are experiencing at any given moment, when it is strong enough. I have been going toward them without quite acknowledging that that was what I was doing. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I think I have been receiving from you as well. I thought the weight I was carrying was still the tiredness from the ritual, but some of it was not proportional. Some of it was larger than what I was actually experiencing." He said, "You have been feeling what I carry." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is considerable." He said, with the dry edge, "I am the Alpha King." She said, "That is not an explanation." The corner of her mouth moved. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I need to speak to Marin." Marin arrived in the receiving room with the expression of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for 2 weeks and was now about to set it down, and whose relief at setting it down was complicated by the fact that setting it down meant accounting for having carried it in the first place. She sat across from them both, and she did not make them work for the truth. She told it directly, because the moment for any other approach had passed a long time ago. The transfusion ritual, in the documented original cases, did not conclude at the physical end of the ritual process. The abbreviated summaries of the ritual that had become the standard reference material over the centuries had left out an element that the original documentation recorded clearly, because the original documentation had been written by people who had witnessed the full effect, and the abbreviated versions had been produced by people working from those accounts, who had considered this element secondary to the medical purpose, and had edited it accordingly. The element that had been edited out was what the original texts called the bond echo. Each participant in the ritual carried, afterward, a residual thread of the other's emotional experience, not their thoughts, not their memories, not their internal narration. Their emotional state, the raw underpinning of what they were feeling, transmitted through the thread when the feeling was strong enough. The thread existed in both directions. It was not constant or identical in strength in both. It responded specifically to what was genuine in the feeling being carried through it, deepening in proportion to the authenticity of what passed through it, weakening or going quiet when what was being felt was managed or performed rather than real. She had known this when she performed the ritual. She had assessed, in the moment before performing it, that disclosing an uncertain side effect before conducting the only available procedure to save a life was not the correct choice. She acknowledged, now, that she should have disclosed it in the days following, and that she had allowed too much time to pass without doing so. Calum looked at her steadily for a measured moment. His face was doing the thing it did when he was receiving difficult information and determining what to do with it, holding it carefully, not reacting until the holding was complete. He said, "Thank you for telling us now." He said it without heat and without reproach, and without the particular kind of coolness that was its own kind of reproach. He said it as the simple acknowledgement of a person accepting a present fact. Maren nodded. She left. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the afternoon was going toward evening. Sarah was looking at her hands. Caleb was looking at the wall. Neither of them was looking at each other, which was not because they were avoiding each other, but because they were both doing what they did when they received significant information, which was to hold it first and speak second. She said, after a moment, "The thread deepens with authenticity." He said, "Yes." She said, "Which means that what we have been feeling from each other is the real version." He said, "Yes." Another pause. She said, "You have been carrying a great deal." He looked at her. He said, "I am aware." She said, "I mean specifically that you have been carrying it alone for a long time, and that this is visible through the thread, and that I am not saying it as a criticism, but as an observation, and that the difference between those two things is important to me." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Why does the difference matter to you?" She said, "Because a criticism is about what you have done wrong. An observation is about what is true. You have not done anything wrong. You have been doing the work of an entire position by yourself for 11 years. That is true. It is not a failing, it is simply a fact, and I prefer facts to judgments." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The bond echo between them was warm in the way it had become over the weeks, the warmth of something that had been present long enough to stop being new, and had become instead continuous. It carried, right now, something from both directions, and both directions were the same, and neither of them needed to say what it was. The evening came into the room in its quiet way. Neither of them moved to light a candle. They sat in the comfortable dark and let the thread between them carry what it carried, which was real, and which was growing, and which had not needed either of them to choose it in order to be genuine, though what they did with it next would require choosing, and they both understood this. That conversation was still ahead of them. But first, other people were going to weigh in.